Thank you very much. Really appreciate people being here on a Saturday morning. The intention of this meeting is to walk through each department in Alberta to talk about the issues. This is to help empower Alberta Resistance members. I'm running the Calgary-Bow Recall campaign right now. I'm looking to recall our Minister of Education, Dimitrios Nicolaides. And yeah, just a bit of background on me. I'm a geophysicist. I worked in the oil and gas industry for 22 years and became a liability expert in the last 10 years of my career. And from that, realized that we should be centering our efforts around land stewardship laws and water rather than around energy. And so I'm doing all that I can to help empower people with that knowledge. When I'm done, then I'd love to get some feedback. If anybody has any thoughts about how we've answered these issues, if you have any comments or questions or concerns, we'd love to make the changes. And I'll just start sharing my presentation and explain why. This presentation is to empower Alberta, the Alberta Resistance members, and a Recall for Change. That's what we've called ourselves in Calgary-Bow volunteers. So what are the issues? So I'll walk through the top 3 issues that we've put in the form. So again, if somebody says, no, I don't have any concerns, then we say, well, let me help you understand a few things that are going on. So we've been letting them know about 3 things, and I'll walk through that. And then I'll just go through the other ministries. And then I'd love to know, like I said, what have we missed? Can you help us clarify the message on each of these issues or whatever? But I was thinking about this before presenting today. This isn't exactly the funnest of presentations because we're just basically walking through all the ways that the government is not doing their job. But think of this as a way for us to empower ourselves and empower others in this information so that we can do something with it. That's what this recall is all about. Okay, so the first thing we've raised is, I can see some familiar faces in here. We bring up the coal mining. So if somebody says, no, I don't have any issues, we say, let me inform you. Are you aware of the fact that the Alberta government has lifted the coal ban that was set in place just 3 short years ago by the UCP government in 2022? And so here's the walkthrough of what that is. In 2022, we had this coal policy committee make recommendations, and there's been Supreme Court rulings that have stated that they've tried to test this ruling 3 times and have failed. Yet in 2023, late 2023, Brian Jean announced that he wanted us to relook at Grassy Mountains and see if it was an advanced coal project or not. And then as that hearing was proceeding, and I see, like I said, Alan's here. So we had Livingston Landowner Group as one of the major players in that hearing. And in the middle of that hearing, we got word that the Alberta government lifted the coal ban. And I forgot to say, in December, right before Christmas, December 20th, Brian Jean suggested that there was going to be this magical coal policy that would help us do coal mining and not pollute our water, which even if that were possible, we've had coal mining companies, Atrium in particular, in their arguments for the lawsuit that they're looking to pursue with the Alberta government, they state flat out that it doesn't matter if this coal policy has some new technology to use. They can't afford to use it. Open pit mining is the only way that they can proceed. So there's no coal policy out there that's going to make this a good strategy. And as Alan was saying yesterday, we can't undo this. We can't make this mistake. We can't afford to make this mistake. One thing that is obviously very close to home for me is Alberta has what is estimated to be a $260 billion liability problem. So that is from the 275,000 oil and gas sites that are on the landscape, plus the oil sands. So the oil sands is about 100,000 hectares. Think of that as 100,000 football fields and 1.7 trillion liters of wastewater that has not been addressed by the oil and gas companies. And on the conventional side, just last week, I think, the Alberta government came out with this mature asset strategy. They created a committee that was industry or industry-friendly individuals. It was highly selective of the people that were allowed to participate in that. I know people that were personally rejected in their participation. And they came out with 2 strategies in this, which is 1, they want to create a closure company, and 2, they want to create a retirement co. So basically they'd harvest co. That's what it is. They want to harvest the reserves and they want to close reserves. But the problem is we have an orphan program that's in place that is intended to do just that on the dime of the oil and gas industry. So the intention was in the 90s, when the oil and gas industry was seeing this mounting problem of liabilities, they said, don't worry about it. Don't make us put up deposits. But when things get bad, when things get rough, we'll be there for you and we will hold the bag. So how that is determined is by a percentage of liability. So companies like CNRL and Suncor and Imperial are high percentage owners of the orphan problem. So this is the direct problem that we have. And, you don't need to look far to know that these are the people that are helping support this potential mature asset strategy, because there was a letter of 14 companies, of which these are the major company or liability owners, asking for the federal government to relax methane regulations and allow them to pursue pipelines, all in the face of trying to actually get sites off the landscape. That just keeps us moving down that path. And then, so yeah, now that the coal mine is open throughout the eastern slopes, the action is that we have to look as citizens for applications to come through the AER and make a claim against them. So we have to have standing. There's a lot of work for citizens to be able to fight that. And the royalties aren't even good. So the last thing I'll say on that is we make about $7 to $23 million per year in coal. This is not something that is saving our province from anything, even if we think that's there. And then as far as jobs are concerned, it's extremely likely that most of this would be automated work and very few jobs associated with it. The next we want to talk about is the defunding of our public schools. So there's been a steady transition of public dollars going to private or charter schools. To quantify that, in 2022, that number was 42 million. In 2024, that number is 408 million. So charter schools receive 100% of public funding. They can charge fees, they can create income, and they can choose who they want to attend their schools. So they receive 70% of public funding, and public schools receive 100% funding, of course, but they're limited in the fees that they can charge, and they have to accommodate everyone. They don't have the flexibility to reject students like these private and charter schools can. The curriculum, so the government has not listened to the recommendations of teachers. They weren't consulted before for the UCP curriculum development, and no consultation, no resources, and no meaningful feedback was accepted. And again, so I'm just reiterating for you. And I should say that this is the work that's been done by the Alberta Resistance. All of these links in this presentation, which we'll make available to folks, all lead to articles to support all of these statements. And so this is outlining how we are disproportionately putting pressure on our public schools, and the charter schools are getting those smaller classrooms and select students. So it's a accelerating and exasperating problem. And then the one thing I will add from my perspective is that I actually raised this. So again, as I said, the education minister is my MLA. Last January, I brought to his attention the fact that I believed there was propaganda being spread in our schools by the fossil fuel industry. And I was asked to leave his office. I was told I was not allowed to come back. And sure enough, just this year, CAPE, so the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and For Our Kids, released a report that had been built that shows there are 39 oil and gas companies that are providing energy information to our kids from K to 12. And in that information is that Alberta has the best laws and that we are doing a great job in terms of managing oil and gas. So obviously not very forthright there. Public healthcare. So this is the third of the three things that we are highlighting for folks. So the $614 million healthcare procurement scandal is one that we're trying to help people know. So this is the firing of the CEO right before she was about to launch an investigation. The Alberta government has appointed a single judge to investigate this issue. The RCMP launched a probe, and currently there are 8 different investigations, but the scope is limited. And there's no public inquiry, which is really what people have been calling for. Private surgical facilities. So this is they're around the scandal. So the scandal is that there is monies going to private healthcare facilities that are providing worse outcomes for people, and it's much more expensive than what we were seeing in the public system. And then now we've had, just on April 1st, the Alberta government has moved AHS facilities under Alberta infrastructure. So again, it's this movement from public institutions, public ownership, to private ownership. And this is right as Minister Guth 2023 resigned from his position as minister. So it's very clear that he knew that this was coming, and that's the reason for his resignation. He has not, however, stepped away from the party. He's still a member of the UCP party, which would be something I think we should be asking for him to reconsider. Again, so the Tyler Shandro and the doctors have been working on an agreement for 5 years. So yeah, Dr. Parks, the president of AMA, has been in several meetings with Minister LaGrange. They signed an MOA, and then that just got thrown away. So they've basically, all the work that they had done to build this has been thrown out. So there's a massive shortage of family physicians and long wait times, and our government has not been forthright in addressing this issue. Okay, so I'm just going to walk through the other ministries now, so anything that we didn't cover. So one of the ministries is accessibility, affordability, and utilities. So we've had the first or second highest insurance premiums in Canada? So although we have low taxes, this is a way that the government has been able to move costs in another area that we might not equate to them. And so it's becoming extremely unaffordable for Albertans to drive. Utility companies get to set the price in Alberta. So we had for a long time we had a ban on economic withholding, and that was reinstated by Minister Savage back in 2022. So the utility companies are able to charge us what they like, and the infrastructure has not been adequately upgraded so that we are paying for all of the excess waste in the system that is not serving for actually providing power. And then, of course, or maybe not, of course, but I guess it was it in 2023 already? But the blocking of the renewables in Alberta led to an estimation of 24,000 jobs that were lost and a loss of $33 billion worth of income that we could have received from that. And additionally, Alberta citizens had paid for a 2035 net zero grid study that the Alberta government has not released. And actually, I could say the same referring back to coal. There was a study on the snowpack in coal that has also not been released, something that we paid for and is not being made available because the outcome is not what they wanted to see, perhaps. We don't know. And then lastly, there's a single organization, this Brownlee LLP, that has been doing all the government contracts for the utilities. And it's a lot of money that's been going to one institution. So there's just some questions there about this private organization running the show, it looks like. Agriculture and irrigation. So again, a little bit of overlap with the coal mining. The opening of the eastern slopes to coal would devastate our agriculture industry, something that we have worked on for decades to build up, would suddenly be devastated. And then also the government is spending more money on dams for the irrigation district, which has been proven not to actually create water. So although it is a short-term benefit to the irrigators, it's not a long-term solution to the problem. Rather, we should be restoring the eastern slopes to get us there. Arts, culture, and the status of women. So there's been $36 million worth of cuts in this area. This is according to the 2025 budget. They took control of legacy art programs. So similar to what we saw when Minister Nicolaides, my same MLA, was the Minister of Advanced Education. He went after the Athabasca University. And then when they didn't do what he wanted, he fired the board and replaced them with friendly folks. This is the same thing that happened with the Banff Center under our new Advanced Education Minister, Rajan Sahani, which they've fired the entire Banff Center board and appointed people to it that are friendly to them. And then obviously the restrictions of rights and freedoms for medical care of trans youth is not something that's just limited to trans youth. This is something that can affect all kids in different stages of development. If there's hormonal deficiencies or anything, this impacts all Albertans for that matter. So although it is obviously directed at a specific group of people, targeting a specific group of people, it is not limited to them, and it's a human rights violation at the end of the day. Children and Family Services. So the government's not paying out the $37 billion in childcare funding from the federal government. The 2025 Alberta budget leaves thousands of children and adults with intellectual disabilities and their families in crisis. So we're seeing a lot of defunding of support staff for people with disabilities, and it's impacting these families more and more each year. And when you consider population growth and inflation, funding has decreased by 50% since 2015. And there's still a hiring freeze on family services despite an estimated 2-year wait for kids to be assessed and adequately supported in their education needs or health needs for that matter. Community and public engagement. So the Alberta government has put out some pandemic misinformation. This has been called out by the Alberta Medical Association and Alberta Law Association. And then Bill 34. So this is the bill that came out to limit FOIP, so the Freedom of Information and Protection Act. We cannot access information. I know people, for example, in Gravel who have requested information on what's been going on with decisions around their water, and they've gotten back all blacked out documents, 90 pages that they're paying for with that is completely blacked out. So it's a real concern about there being less transparency in the government for this. And again, just re-mentioning those reports and those surveys that we pay for, they curate, they don't like the outcome, we don't get to see them. Emergency services and public safety. Again, I think this is something that Ali could probably speak to better than me, but ambulance wait times are at dangerously long waits. And emergency workers are overworked and under-supported. There is potentially a strike that might be coming from that group because of how much they've been unsupported. I remember learning last year that they're supposed to have some downtime on their trucks, and they're at like they're running at 95% with these. So it's always, they're running in a position where they're always at risk of not being able to meet the needs. And then in this area is public safety. So again, there's increased homelessness and addiction in the province. I heard from our mayor in Calgary that there's potentially 100,000 families that are on the verge of losing their homes. We have a massive affordability crisis. And obviously that's leading to a number of other issues that come out of that. When you don't feel safe, you try to do other things. Finances, if you've been paying attention to what Trump has been up to, oil prices dropped to around $60. So even based on this, let's call it $70 oil, if we're expected to go into a $5 billion deficit this year. Yeah, so we're obviously not at 68 right now. So this is a big challenge. And one of the things that has clearly been carried out by the government is to say that we're reducing our taxes, but then they're putting those monies onto property taxes from the provincial government. But the likelihood is people are going to assume that's our municipal government adding on to our costs. And so this is, to me, that sleight of hand, just like I was talking about with the auto insurance, where it looks like they're giving us a break, but really this money is just being put in another bucket and doesn't look like it's coming from them. And then obviously we've got tariffs that are really impacting our ability to sell our oil. So first of all, we export 400 times what we use in Alberta. And of that 400 times, 80% of it goes to the US. And the US has declared economic war against us with tariffs. There's a 10%, just in case anybody has missed it, there is a 10% tariff on oil and gas right now, despite what our premier has said. She suggested that she saved the day. No, there is a 10% tariff on oil and gas. And obviously with those oil prices dropping, Alberta needs at least a $60 oil for there to be economic production here, because our product is quite low grade, low quality. So it's a real concern that we're going to have a wave of bankruptcies because of this. And obviously we're not drilling in $60 oil. So there's going to be a shortage of work for those folks. And I'm just going to say one thing positive. If we collectively push back and remind our government that we have polluter pay laws, there is a $260 billion economy that's in wait. We could unlock this money from the polluters, and all of these workers from the oil and gas industry could be reemployed in cleaning up and restoring our environment. And we have a lot of decades of work ahead of us in that space. And again, just a reminder that the renewables would fall into this as well had we allowed our our industry to flourish, it would at least be helping offset this deficit that we're creating. I grouped together forestry and parks and tourism because they kind of seem to overlap, but Alberta hasn't updated the Forestry Act and is continuing to do clear-cut logging in the headwater forest. This is helping evapotranspiration at an accelerated rate. So when we are in a water shortage, to be clear-cutting in our headwaters is allowing that sun to, hit our mountaintops and evaporate that water before it can get into our streams. So this is something that we should be demanding as far as I'm concerned, as a collective group of Albertans, to say that we cannot afford to be clear-cut logging in our headwaters. And there's an economic case that it's not needed. At the same time, the demand for forest products has dropped dramatically. So it's really an unnecessary risk for us to be taking. And it's because we have let these acts just slide. And what we talk about in sustainability in forestry is not about sustainable ecology. It's about a sustainable production of lumber. So it's a very important distinction that's not being fixed in our laws. And then this allowing of hunting of species at risk, like this cougar that was just killed. I heard that the cubs are now at the Calgary Zoo. We put these laws in place because these species help us thrive. At the end of the day, they're called species at risk because it risks our lives and our ecology. So we need to be protecting these species, not allowing hunting. And I would say there's a conflict of interest there when our minister, Todd Loewen, has a vested interest in this activity. So there's another example of corruption. Immigration and multiculturalism. Alberta has the largest real wage cut in Canada. So we're seeing a discrepancy between our wages and the affordability. So that's a big gap that's happening. And the Alberta is Calling campaign has really impacted affordability in our major cities, especially in cities like Calgary. So what that is that they've given tax breaks, $5,000 in tax breaks for people to move here to do specific jobs in oil and gas and in infrastructure. And a lot of those jobs are not even salary positions. A lot of them are temporary positions. So we can potentially have people come here, settle in, and then not have a job in 6 months' time. So it's causing a really a bunch of instability in our workforce, and it's driving up the prices for locals. There's been a real rental shortage and obviously increase in housing costs because of this. We are relatively more affordable than other provinces. So that's the opportunity for folks. And then the talks about increasing Alberta's population from our current 5 million to 10 million people when we're facing extreme water shortages. This is not a realistic goal, and nor is it something that we're seeing our housing industry being able to keep up with or making way for different forms of housing for folks. Indigenous relations, I can refer to our coal hearing very clearly that the Stoney Nakoda, the Piikani Nation were not consulted on the Grassy Mountain project, for example. Additionally, the oil sands impacts have not been looked at seriously for decades. This issue has been brought up by the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan First Nations for a decade. And they've been, outlining the degradation of the landscape, the issues that they're seeing in the wildlife and fish. And it's at a point where it's becoming potentially catastrophic, with spills happening without even the companies knowing that they're happening, and they're continuing without them addressing them because, again, they're not aware of them happening. So there's been a lot of pushback from the Athabasca Fort Chipewyan First Nation. Specifically right now, they are looking to stop the carbon capture and storage project up there. There hasn't been an environmental impact assessment done on that project, and that's what they're arguing for right now. And to me, an environmental impact assessment would make it clear that it's a no-go. And a lack of consultation on other things like the AI project that they've proposed as well. Thankfully, our First Nations communities have suggested that they do not support this work and are pushing back against that. So it's a voice that we really need to work in solidarity with and push back. There's a lot of opportunity in treaties that can support our efforts in preserving and restoring our landscapes. So this is somewhere we should work for solidarity. Justice and public service. So again, the rule of law is not being upheld. So the evidence that the premier and the health minister and energy ministers, as well as I just said, Todd Loewen, for example, have circumvented court decisions. They've overstepped their authority. They've demonstrated conflict of interests. Rebecca Schulz's husband being a coal lobbyist, for example, and more benefits to private industry rather than public interest. So that's the overall concerns in this space. And the gifts. So the Alberta government legislated that they can receive gifts. And this is actually a part of the healthcare scandal, and how this started being noticed was that the UCP was at hockey games that were paid for by these healthcare companies that have benefited from this privatization of our public system. Yeah, and police violence has increased. Public activism is being held back. And there's still attempts to have a provincial police force. When we have clearly stated as a population that we're not interested in this, it keeps coming up. Infrastructure. So again, we talked about the Alberta Health Services buildings being moved to Alberta Infrastructure. Again, talking about this investment in dams and interbasin transfers, which is all very short-sighted and risky in terms of, contaminating waters from one place to another. We can introduce species that are not present, and that's one way that's an issue, but obviously it doesn't create water. If anything, it just creates more havoc about where water is going and how we are going to have enough to do what we need to do in this province. Yes, and UCP is planning highways, which again, the likelihood of being able to do all of these highways when we are now potentially going to face a bigger than $5 billion deficit seems highly unlikely. It'd be interesting to see what happens there. And then the Alberta government is providing $106 million for the Southern Region Road project. So that's what is earmarked for that. We'll see if that goes forward. Similar to when we talked about finances, jobs, the economy, and trade. So we've talked about this deficit. We've talked about the tariffs and this lack of diversification in other things. Mental health and addiction. So the 2025 budget fails to provide adequate access to mental health services for those in need. The affordable living and housing concerns. So again, we've already talked about that. Increased mental health and disorders and addiction. We've talked about this, the offshoot of the stresses that people are feeling. And the closure of safe consumption sites. So obviously this has led to more hazards on the street. And, the ability for the government to potentially jail people for being addicted is really scary stuff for people that are already suffering. Municipal affairs. So there's been a lot of controlling of municipal dollars at the provincial level, not holding industries to account for unpaid taxes. We talked about liabilities, but obviously unpaid municipal taxes are a big concern. The budget is insufficient to finance the future needs of the municipalities, and the promised tax cuts, as I was saying, it looks like it's going to be an average of $250 per household for those education costs that are being deferred to our property taxes. And yeah, the canceling of photo radar, which was money that was going to the municipalities. So again, I'm not sure what the value of that was, but that's what we've done. Seniors, community and social services attempted of opting us out of the Canadian pension plan. So obviously this is something that I heard while door knocking in the 2023 election. People did not want this to be an issue. And it was almost the first thing that the UCP came out with once they were in was this idea of taking away our CPP. So workers have been fighting for increased wages for months. There's been strikes, and finally we've made headway in terms of settlements, but it's falling short of meeting the increase in inflation for a lot of support workers in the province. Cutbacks for daycare fees. So people are now paying $15 a day, not $10. Underfunding of transportation. So again, this is something that really impacts seniors when you're on a fixed income budget, to not be able to get busing to where you need to go. And then obviously AISH, cutting off people from Alberta disability benefits, it impacts seniors significantly. Service Alberta and red tape reduction. So public services and red tape reduction seem to be lifted for industry and put up for people. So our lack of access to things. And again, we talked about FOIP, the freedom of information being reduced for us, and gambling changes in Bill 48, which I have to admit I'm not familiar of, but you can find some information on it here. Yes, so again, we've talked similar in technology and innovation. This is a lack of diversification in our in our markets, and these AI centers, which we now are appreciating from the Chinese that centralized AI centers are not even of benefit. Decentralized distributive centers are more beneficial. So this is very old thinking to be pursuing AI data centers in the province. And to me, it's to increase the need for energy demand in our province rather than thinking about water. Transportation and economic corridors. So driving has become more and more expensive. We talked about insurance earlier, that lack of public transportation, undermining of public infrastructure projects like the Green Line here in Calgary just before it was about to go, and interfering with the city's attempts to slow down. That's, again, the photo radar restrictions being lifted. And rural transit ideas have, rather than investing in rural transit, they're talking about doing a high-speed train between Calgary and Banff. So again, this is this opportunity for people that can afford the luxury of going between Calgary and Banff via rail rather than getting us people at the average person to work, for example. Okay, so that's all of them. So again, the intention of this is to be able to use this in this door knocking tool that we have. So if there's any changes or additions or anything, I will make this a part of that tool for folks that are door knocking for us, so that they have the ability to say, okay, yeah, I know what you mean. This is what we're seeing too, or here's some information on that for you, for people. So that's the intention of this. So I'll stop sharing, and if anybody has any additional thoughts, I'd love to hear them. So they haven't done it yet, but this report came out and suggested that they're trying to create another entity that would, the Albertans would support these entities. So meaning that we would be the backstop if these companies couldn't fail, or if the production wouldn't cover the costs of closure, we'd be the people that would be the backstop, which is, like I said, in the face of our polluter pay laws that were designed by industry themselves. So yeah, AIMCO. So AIMCO is currently the pension funder for the Alberta teachers. I mean, it certainly appears like AIMCO would be the operator of choice for an Alberta pension fund. Why I bring it up and why it's so important is because AIMCO is disproportionately barely solvent oil and gas companies, and is on the verge of potentially being catastrophic if oil prices stay suppressed and other companies go bankrupt. So this is a big issue that is going to surface for teachers and firefighters. Firefighters have 10% of their fund, their retirement pension is also in AIMCO. I'm going to use a specific example. Shell has attempted to transfer assets to a company called Paraday Energy. Paraday has never been in the black, and therefore thankfully the Alberta government backed, and I can say this because it's public, because of the Orphan Well Association and Canadian Natural and other companies that were directly affected by that potential transfer, they withheld consent from that transfer. So those licenses actually sit in Shell's name, even though it looks like they're Paraday's on the books. Well, Paraday has been bailed out by AIMCO. Just recently, they were bailed out by AIMCO. So this is a perfect example of a company that has never been profitable, that is being funded, supported by Alberta teachers. So, and this is the risk that we have if we were to allow an Alberta pension fund to prevail. Stephen Harper, our former prime minister, is now heading this pension fund. It is just shocking. The Banff Rail, I did want to highlight that the premier's husband is one of the companies that will benefit from the Banff Rail. So again, another conflict of interest that is right out there in the open for us to see. The goal of the recall, if anybody isn't clear, is to do, at least call it 10 of these so that we land at 6 UCP MLAs that get ejected from their spot, and we can potentially have an early election. So that is the goal of these recalls. And the intention here is to help people feel empowered to get involved, help us door knock, get the message out so that we can get this happening.
Thank you, Jenny. This is a brilliant presentation, and the information is so important, especially in this format. So hopefully we can get this out to even a larger audience than the memberships that we have now in ABR. Yeah. Wonderful job. Great.
Thank you so much for the space, Ali. And again, that's, if anybody wasn't aware, Ali is hosting these speaker series to dive in on some of these specific issues with people that are very close to it. So that's what the intention of this series is, in parallel to the work we're doing at the Doors. Ali has been a tremendous help at the Doors, leading the door knocking campaign for me So thank you very much for everything you're doing for the Alberta Resistance, Sally.
Thanks, everybody.